عاملة كده يا دكتور محمود.
Good evening to all of you joining us today, February 24th, for one of the Tahrir dialogue sessions. This session is online. Usually our Tahrir dialogue series happen in person on the American University in Cairo's Tahrir campus. But today we have the session online. And the theme of today's session is the state of the world after the inauguration of President Donald Trump for a second term in office, which happened exactly 34 days ago. And in those 34 days, a lot has happened. I'm reminded of a statement by David Smith, the bureau chief of the Guardian journal in Washington, D.C., who considered Trump's second presidency, I quote, the most powerful presidency in US history, given that Mr. Trump has reshaped the Republican Party in his own image, has the majority in both houses, and a majority of judges on the Supreme Court. This power comes with an unusual style of leadership that's transactional, unpredictable, and oblivious to international law and multilateralism. Globally, Mr. Trump is doubling down on the war of tariffs and sanctions. Regionally, he may be destabilizing the Middle East and the transatlantic alliance with Europe. We are indeed in a different world today than the world many of us grew up in. And we have with us tonight two distinguished speakers with a vast amount of knowledge and insight that we need, badly need, in such uncertain and volatile times. I'm grateful for the time that my distinguished speakers have given us today, and definitely also grateful for their thoughts. A word about how today's webinar will run. I will introduce each speaker before he speaks. Each will get around 10 minutes to kick us off with a summary of global affairs 34 days into Mr. Trump's second presidency. I will follow up with few questions and then open the conversation. So please go ahead and write your questions in the chat room as they occur to you, and I will be reading your questions when the time comes for our distinguished speakers to answer them. We will start first with His Excellency Nabil Fahmy, who established the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the American University in Cairo and led it for quite a number of years, from 2009 until 2022. His Excellency had a distinguished diplomatic career since 1976. He served as Egypt's foreign minister, Egypt's ambassador to the United States and Japan, and had numerous other government and international positions, including the chairmanship of the United Nations Advisory Board on Disarmament. His Excellency Nabil Fahmy was a member of the Egyptian delegation to the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference and the review conferences of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. He's also a member of the Supreme Advisory Council of the Beijing Forum in China and serves on the boards of numerous universities and think tanks. And he is an author of several acclaimed books, both in English and in Arabic. Well, Your Excellency Nabil Fahmy, Mr. Donald Trump has set the global time on maximum speed, so I don't feel too bad about giving you 10 minutes to summarize where we stand since he came to power. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean McCary. Thank you very much for inviting me back to the Tahrir Dialogues. And thank you for doing so with Dr. Muhyiddin, whom I have a long-standing relationship and I hold in high standing. I'm going to be sort of the devil's advocate here. Everybody is talking about Trump, and understandably so. He's larger than life, in your face, so it's difficult to ignore it. But I actually think Trump is the result of a problem rather than the catalyst or the change maker, so to speak. And what I mean by this is, for me, Trump, nationalist movements, isolationism, even some level of radicalism, is all a function of one malady, I don't mean this as an insult or criticism of Trump per se. I just mean being out of the box or anti-establishment. It is, for me, the world is in disorder. And it's in disorder because the world order is based on the premise that existed over half a century ago, but doesn't exist any longer. The package after World War II was between the victors, East and West, and they basically divided the package based on a balance of power and respect for each other's spheres of influence. That was the basic package. There was a tug of war every now and then, but ultimately they refrained as much as they could from any direct confrontation with each other on that basis. Once the balance of power broke, and it broke essentially when the Soviet Union failed in its competition with the West, economically, first of all, more than militarily. Once that happened, needless to say, spheres of influence were not any longer sacrosanct. And the original agreement was challenged over and over and over again. Initially without much of a reaction from Russia because it was weak. And then slowly they took on the mantle a little bit stronger. At the same time, all of this happened while globalization was happening. Globalization was happening and the world became closer. The problems became closer to each other. And even the most successful could not remain away from, if you want, the challenges of the times. And I'll give you one example, refugees. Refugees went to where the economic progress was, and that led to questions in those societies. But the best example, or the indication of the turbulence that existed both in Russia and Soviet Union and in America, just look at their leadership. Soviet Union and Russia moved from Gorbachev to Yeltsin to Putin. Three contradictory figures. America did even more than that. In the same period of time, it moved from George Bush, the father, to Clinton, to Bush, the son, to Obama, to Trump, to Biden, and to Trump again. It's like not a merry-go-round. You're riding a roller coaster here of political mindset. That means that Americans were not sure where they wanted to go and what they wanted to be, especially globally, but also locally. And in Europe, you saw the emergence of right-wing groups. Now, let me add here what's particular to the American setup. America and, if you want, the developing countries in the West, there was a gradual growing vacuum between the elite, be they in politics or in business, and the average in each community. And more, you found people who were marginalized, not in terms of finance only, but also in terms of they couldn't relate to their leadership. The leadership was too far off from them. And so you ended up in America with people who could not relate to the leadership and two parties that lost their message completely. When you look at the names I mentioned as presidents, each time, every 4 years, you had a completely different, except for Obama, completely different perspective of politics. So in the absence of a strong political message, you had somebody like Trump, who, by the way, was initially a Democrat. Then he became independent. Then he became a Republican. And he became anti the establishment. He won the first time through the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. Second time around, after Biden, he won both. And he has a majority in both houses of Congress, which shows you that the anger in America and the disturbance in America has actually increased over this period of time. Now, I can come back later and in more detail on Trump per se, if you don't want me to go too long, but I would argue that this is not Trump 2.0. This is Trump 4.0. because he's back with a vengeance. He was always an outsider, even in business. And then in politics, he was also an outsider. He won again after losing. And what did he do immediately? He did not, it was not suffice for him to offer new policies. Although I think in the first day, he signed 135 executive orders or something of that magnitude. But he's now after the institutions themselves, because in Trump 1.0, he felt that the deep state in America held him down. The same applies, by the way, to the deep state internationally. So you're going to see Trump trying to change the international order as well. He's criticized the UN. He's criticized WTO and I think UNESCO, if I'm not mistaken. He has openly criticized the NATO alliance and its members. All of this for him isn't really functional because it does not serve America first. For him, it has to serve America first, and there has to be tangible response, tangible return on America. And let me close my first intervention with, beside his policy issues, he's a bully. So you see him taking on everybody at the same time, which is fine by me. And I would say one good word about Trump. But he's also taking on quite vehemently allies and adversaries at the same time. It's not a matter of, do I have a problem with this? He's taking on his allies much more than his adversaries, so forth. And my good comment about Trump is he wants to get things done. Now, I don't like what he wants to get done, and I'll address that in my second intervention. But he's not about long processes. And I think for a good 20, 30 years, the American position on many issues, especially on the Middle East, has been more process than content. So I differ with Trump on his Middle East policies, but the fact that he talks to his adversaries, including really far ones like North Korea, and recently arranging for Putin, I think is a good step. But he needs to fall back on, we don't want more disorder, we want more order. And therefore we want rule of law to govern, not the force of law. Excuse me, the force of law to govern, not the rule of force.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Just the powerful introduction that I was hoping for. I'll get back to you after we hear from His Excellency Dr. Mahmoud Mohiuddin to tell us, unpack for us a little bit more the politics of vengeance and what does he really want to get done. We'll get back to that in a short while. Dr. Mahmoud Mohiuddin, it's such a pleasure to have you with us. As a distinguished economist with over 30 years of expertise in international finance and development, and a UN Special Envoy on financing the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, as well as a leader of the group of prominent experts appointed by the UN Secretary General to promote solutions for the debt crisis. Dr. Mahmoud Mohiuddin served as the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP27 as well. And he served as executive director at the IMF and held leadership roles at the World Bank, alongside having served as Egypt's Minister of Investment from 2004 to 2010. Dr. Mahmoud Mohiuddin is professor of economics and finance at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at Cairo University and a visiting professor at several renowned universities in Egypt, Korea, the UK, and the USA. He's also a visiting senior research scholar at Columbia Business School and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, as well as an author of several books and numerous articles in leading journals. I do not know, gentlemen, how do you find time to sleep, but both of you obviously do not sleep. Dr. Mahmoud Mohiuddin, the floor is yours to kick us off with your reading of the state of the world since Trump came to power. Over to you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dean McCawie, and let me join His Excellency Ambassador Nabil Fahmy for thanking you for this opportunity, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be with him in this timely discussion. I think on what I prepared earlier, I want going to change it just to be different from what Ambassador Fahmy just started us with, because what I prepared based on following updates, analysis, and some discussions and monitoring the announcements of Mr. Trump, I think confirms, perhaps from a political economy perspective, what Ambassador Fahmy started us with. What kind of a problem that Mr. Trump is trying to solve? He's not the problem. He didn't create it. He came in a system. That system chose him through free elections. He won the vote. Nobody challenged the elections this time. And that gets us into kind of understanding what's really wrong with America at large and the American economy in particular, that gets us into these kind of choices that Mr. Trump is basically symbolizing the choice by action as well. As we could call it in Arabic, he is an answering to Nida al-Shab. This is the call of the people. He's answering it. This is what he believes in. He survived many hurdles, but I'll come back to that. So what's the puzzle really? If we see the American economy today with a comparison of the point that I mark as the point by which whatever we had of economic financial arrangements ended with, which is basically the global financial crisis of 2008. So based on some understanding that the 20th century didn't end as we know it by the end of the century, it ended exactly in 2008 with whatever happened after that. The global financial crisis, at that time, you see the American economy almost equivalent in size to the Eurozone economy. Today, the American economy is a quarter of the global economy, and it's double of the size of the Eurozone economy, double size. Japan, one of the superpowers, G7 country, as you mentioned, Ambassador Fahmy served there. During the time of his service there is no correlation, no causality. He was a witness that the Japanese were on average 50% wealthier than the Americans. Today, the Americans are about 140% richer than the Japanese. So in terms of the advanced economies and comparing the US to its peers, it has been doing very well, recovering fast from each crisis that we had seen during the last 2 decades, including crises that the US economy or the US policies were very much responsible for, including the global financial crisis. But this doesn't mean that the US economy is problem-free. It has problems of debt. So far, they can sustain honoring their debt because they have what Minister Distan, before he became President Distan, called it the American privilege, which is basically the kind, or the exuberant privilege, as he called it, that you can borrow and you can pay through your printer. And if you are wise in doing that, that will not have inflationary impact. So this is one, but they are worried if people started to think of alternatives. But so far, the US dollar is in a good position. It's 60% of international reserves. It's more than 90% of the transactions being settled in dollar terms. The talks about alternatives, the euro didn't exceed 20%, BRICS is very, very far from coining a currency of its own. The renminbi is very far as well for reasons that I can explain, that it's not really in a position to be internationalized so far. That could change, but so far it doesn't. So but that issue is a big problem. The other thing is basically the competitiveness and productivity. In relative terms, the U.S. Economy is still very much productive. They spend on R&D. It's the largest economy with the biggest army in the world, supported by the most advanced technology. But again, there are issues of relative decline comparing the U.S. to the U.S., not to Europe, which suffers from what Prime Minister Draghi called it the existential crisis because of the widening gap between them and the Americans and the Chinese when it comes to competitiveness. But what is exactly the biggest problem? That I would say that the prime cause of the trouble is basically the inequality in the US and the frustration of the middle class that Ambassador Fahmy mentioned, that they have shared perhaps their anger or their frustration through these kind of choices. This is my interpretation of what he said. So we see inequality by every measure. The latest article from Foreign Affairs, I quote a good article by Dr. Beckley. He cited a survey in which the Americans believe that the country is on the wrong track. Nearly 70% rate the economy as not good or poor. Public trust in government has fallen by half, from 40% in 2000, 20% to 20% today. Love of the country or patriotism is fading too. Only 38% of the Americans now say that patriotism is very important, down from 70% in 2000. This is before the elections. So here, when Mr. Trump comes again and say, make America great again, he has the support of the survey and the frustration of people. It's basically the inequality. So one would say, and you are in a top university in our country, say, well, this is not the best way to solve. If you have an inequality problem, there are many things that you can really be doing to have more inclusive growth, invest in human capital, deal with your competitiveness, have your fiscal policy to support it, tax the rich, redistribute that to the poor. All of that stuff will take time. The easiest way to deal with the problems is basically a populist agenda. That is American populist agenda. Tariffs and migrants are very much obvious targets. So you have this kind of selection of measures. People will be very happy in the short term. In the long term, as Mr. Keynes reminds us, we're all dead. And here in politics, here, Mr. Trump is very much in a race against time, because he doesn't just have the 4-year limit, though that some people tinker that he can do something like Mr. Putin and he could become a vice president or something like that. But beyond these games, he has 4 years, and those 4 years could be shortened by 2 things. By God and his calls on people and their lives, or by politics. Within 2 years, this could change if the House is not as described today, including by the reference of Ambassador Fahmy, that the majority are on the side of the current president. But I like just to say a couple of things very quickly, and I'll come back just to explain the behavior and impact on countries, because so far this is this new Trump. It's not really Trump 2.0, and I don't Trump 4. This is something I may consider taking from Ambassador Fahmy, but he's a different Trump with experience, more ready to act, getting older, not necessarily wiser, getting faster in his action, has more aligned teams, not just one team, teams behind him. And he is in a race against time to have the following: revolution at home. And those who criticize Mr. Musk, that is one of the biggest allies and aides to him, it's not Mr. Musk. Actually, a day or two ago, the president of the United States urged Mr. Musk to do even more, that he's not happy with his pace. If you call Mr. Musk a disruptor, so we have the ultimate disruptor in the name of Mr. Trump. The other thing is basically what he does abroad. Here it's not transactional. Dean McCow, you started by saying, yes, he was transactional in his first term. This time, he's not necessarily transactional. Here, I like to refer to the good work of Ian Bremmer, a good political scientist and analyst. He's transactional with those who can not be but transactional with them, big countries like China. But look at the way that he deals with Europe. He's not transactional. He's determined. He knows what he's doing. He's pushing. He's not after transaction. He's after his way. So we need to make a distinction between where exactly he could be transactional and where exactly he could really be more forcible than that and predatory.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful start of hopefully a very good and insightful conversation. Let me get back to each one of you with a question, and I see the chat room is starting to fill up with the questions from the audience. But let me start first by going back to His Excellency Nabil Fahmy and asking, you have introduced this conversation with the politics of vengeance, and the Doge is a good example of what this politics of vengeance means on the domestic level. But on the international level, some people might think, is this also politics of vengeance, trying to destabilize the Middle East, which has always been a very important region for the United States, trying to destabilize the transatlantic alliance, which was important and some things should still remain important in the competition with Russia and China? Back to your question, what is the agenda that Mr. Trump, with his politics of vengeance internally and externally, is trying to achieve?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that and for your comments. Let me, like Dr. Mohideen, draw a distinction between Trump with somebody that he feels is a player and with somebody that he feels is weak. It's a completely different posture. Globally, his only real concern is China. That's the rising force internationally that Trump is afraid about. And the concern is, one, because the upward curve is quite significant, and it includes not only economic development on technology, but also military capacity. Although I don't really see any theater except maybe Taiwan, where there would be a military conflict between China and the US. But the American establishment, and here, frankly, Trump and the establishment are the same, consider China to be the strategic threat. They don't consider Russia to be of major concern. Now, for Trump, he appears much closer to Russia for two reasons. One, he has no great respect for the NATO alliance. So Russia was never, in his mind, never really a threat. And it isn't a threat if you talk to it. I would argue that I think he's both wrong and right. I think if you want to change an alliance, you need to do that from within rather than from outside, because ultimately, alliances are based most of all on confidence. If they don't have confidence in each other, then ultimately it has really no value. But I think he has valid reason to say things in NATO have to be changed. They can't function the same way with Russia as the threat, and with Europeans not really paying the targeted 2% budget in defense. But that being said, the idea that I took you back at the beginning to the world order. Frankly, the West came so close to Russia. It's quite surprising that Russia waited for so long before they reacted. But they did so because they were weak. And ultimately, they reacted in the wrong way. I consider the invasion of Ukraine a violation of international law. That being said, I fully understand why they did it, because the West had broken the understanding reached with Russia that they wouldn't get closer and closer over the years, and they did. So he will deal with Russia, but he will no longer look at Russia as the main threat. That's going to put him in a precarious situation with the NATO alliance. It won't be destroyed, but it's definitely not going to be as strong in the past. I think you heard the newly elected leader or potential leader for Germany saying that we want to have an independent Europe or something of the sort. That's one point. The other point, whether it is in Europe, but even more so on the Middle East, rules, laws are not part of his package. They don't come into play. Furthermore, history doesn't come into play either. It's all about who has power in a positive or a negative sense, who is a player. So I will work with who is a player, and his vision, his personal vision is Israel is a stronger player than anybody else in the Middle East. And if you leave Israel aside, the other strong player is money. And that takes him towards the Gulf. He didn't start the Middle East war, so for him, he has no real game in it. And his supporters in America tend to be very strong supporters of the right wing in Israel. I mean, his American Jewish supporters and the evangelical supporters are very close to Israel. So he's come up with this rather bizarre package. But rather bizarre, I'm being very diplomatic after 35 years in diplomacy, where to solve a problem, you remove the people. How that solves the problem or why they should leave after 70 years is mind-boggling. But then he adds to it, and I'll take it. Take it. How? From who? What are you going to do with it? And I won't pay for anything. Again, who's going to pay? Well, the Arabs have a lot of money. So you want to remove the Palestinians, and you take Gaza, and the Arabs pay for the whole thing that Israel destroyed. There's a lack of any sort of logic here if you have a sense of history. But for a businessman, these are positives and negatives. How do you deal with them? There's no empathy or respect for history or rules. So I would argue that his proposal is not only very odd, it's also very dangerous. And I say this because whether he implements, he's not going to implement it because Arabs won't agree. But even if he backtracks, and he's backtracked a little bit, he's going to encourage the right wing in Israel to be much more aggressive in the territories, especially on the West Bank, possibly also in Gaza, but on the West Bank. And I will throw out to you here, before summer, the Israelis will have formally annexed the West Bank, and he will recognize them as sort of the second best issue. And then he will focus on Arabs who have money. So the answer by the Arabs should be, one, and I will stop, be friends with everybody, but don't overly depend on anybody. Secondly, you need to be more of a player in your own region, because he's agnostic to policy issues, but he is attracted to players. So if you're a player in your region, he will be interested in trying to deal with you, even oppose you if you may. But if you're complacent and reactive to him, you're not going to get very far. So my concerns about Trump globally and regionally, one is he's really eradicating any even minor respect for law and order. And I'd like to see an evolution in the world scene. I don't want a revolution throughout the whole world. And he's also disregarding right and wrong and history in the Middle East. So it's going to be a turbulent time, but the reaction should not be ignoring Trump. America is too big to ignore, but it should be taking more charge of your own affairs and engaging Trump with, let me summarize it in 3 points. One, with bullies, you don't negotiate. So the answer needs to be clear. This proposal is not accepted. Point two, this is our counter proposal. Very clear, concrete proposal that deals with not only the symptoms of the problem, but also the problem. And thirdly, explain to him how this kind of proposal benefits America in A, B, C, and D, or the alternative is detrimental to America in E, D, and F, because whether it's Trump, Biden, or whoever else is elected, America is an important player internationally. And no matter what happens, we will connect with each other in different areas.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll come back to you with some more deep dive into some of the things you said, Your Excellency. But let me move to Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin and say the way you have so nicely summarized the state of affairs of the United States right now as we speak seems to me to be, if I can put it this way, slightly more optimistic than some of the characterizations that we've seen Nobel Prize winners like Joseph Stiglitz and Darren Acemoglu put out recently in Project Syndicate and other places, where they say either it's the end of progress, meaning the end of liberal democracy and progressive policies, or it's the end of US edge in innovation and technology, because the summing up of everything he's doing internally will end up hurting the United States competitiveness rather than not. In other words, as I am echoing some of the questions in the chat room, would you agree with those who are pessimistic and saying actually Trump is doing nothing else but accelerating the decline of American competitiveness, American power, and even American hegemony? Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin.
Right. Okay. Both Professor Stiglitz and Acemoglu live in America, and the Americans, they are concerned about American fate or decline. I like to take more focus on the implications. But let me tell you, I have a great deal of admiration to both scholars. I work very closely, as you know now, with Professor Stiglitz on areas related to that. And actually, Acemoglu is coming with his admiration to a topic that he's researched forever. And for that, he got Nobel Prize in economics, which is the importance and effectiveness of institutions. And everyone knows his famous book, co-authored, on why nations fail. And he's very much right about that, because we see the transactions, we see the actions, but there are no policy, there is no follow-up mechanisms, and there are weakening of institutions. So whether that is going to be really doing more for the United States in making it better or not, I think Professor Stiglitz mentioned the example of Sputnik, that you can even reach the skies, but you fail at home, an indication of a collapse of the Soviet Union. But I still bet on the dynamism, democracy, freedom of speech, and the antibodies in the system, in the American freedoms that can protect it against these ills in the short term, midterm, 2 years, 4 years. And then now you have checks and balances. If they go in that direction, what can I say? It will be the people's choice. If a man elected, winning the popular vote and the college vote, what can we do? So, but here, let me check more on the implications. Yes, institutions are weakened. Policy, there are no directions of policies. If there are some problems mentioned by Ambassador Fahmy now in the political area and the competition or struggle between the powers, it's much more complicated even in the economic side when you are trying to find where exactly the real story from the ploy, from the distraction to the transaction. So I think here, analysts and those who are monitoring matters closely, they need really to pay more attention to all of these kind of measures. And I just, rather than talking abstract, let me just try to put exactly not just the implications of the United States, but the implications on the rest of us, on our economies in the region. And I'm very much like as well what Ambassador Fahmy mentioned, because if you are in trouble globally, countries would resort to their own regions to make it stronger. The biggest region in the world is the United States, not North America. The United States in itself is the biggest, by economic definition, the biggest region in the world. Comes after that, the EU is struggling. Then we have a fantastic model working, the ASEAN. I admire, as if they have taken the kind of lesson for many years now of what Ambassador Fahmy mentioned about, well, don't go and make enemies, but protect yourselves and do more together. Our problem really that our region is not really ready for this kind of work, and it should be ready on trade, on investment, in technology, depoliticizing these transactions, being more pragmatic. And in a country like Egypt, our region is Arab, our region is African, our region is Mediterranean, so we can really do more regionally. But when it comes to the channels of impact of what Mr. Trump and actually both Stiglitz and Nishimoglu and others have been monitoring, trade in the way that is being used with the tariffs, it's a double-edged sword. And actually the sharper edge of it could be directed to you by the impact of inflation. When it comes to capital, the issue here, there are two sides. If a country is dependent on aid, say a country like South Sudan, 50% of its budget is dependent on aid. A country like Egypt, I'm not talking about the military side of it, but the civil side of it, it's insignificant. So it's symbolic of relations that could really be changed in a different way, from aid to trade, from aid to investment, from aid even to zero. That will not really impact a country like Egypt much. It can impact some segments and some pockets if they are still dependent on aid, if there is an office somewhere funded by aid or a particular program is, but again, in few months or few weeks, that could be substituted by. So here, issues about aid and its impact need really to see, are you talking about South Sudan, Sudan, or Egypt, or a sub-Saharan African country, or an aid that is basically being used as part of soft power. Issues related to migration, the impact is more on the neighboring countries, and country in particular like Mexico. But for us, how many are we out of the 11 million that Mr. Trump is concerned about? But again, it gives some sort of signals about the issues about freedom of access to the US labor market and the US society. Then there are other things that could be even more critical to consider. Technology, access to technology. And they could really put some restrictions. And they started that like a few years ago. This preceded Mr. Trump. Actually, when they were talking about use the Chinese technology, today you will not use our technology tomorrow. And then you have issues related to indirect impacts through the impact on multilateralism. If the multilateral system is weakened, and many of the countries are dependent on it, on technical assistance or the firefighters when it comes to trouble like the IMF, the World Bank, and others, that could really have a kind of a second round impact of these policies. But, and I'll finish here by two other examples that could really even less obvious. One is by importing the bad ideas. If somebody says that Mr. Trump is adopting these kind of mercantilist policies, let's do like him. It's like what you see in dangerous stuff on TV. They would tell you don't do it at home. So don't do it in your own country if you cannot afford it. The US can still do it, can distract, can disrupt, but still the dollar could be strengthened, and the impact of it, the spillovers will be on you. And then the other thing, the fight between China and the US, there is what we call the innocent bystander. In this kind of fight between the two giants, you could be flooded by product that you don't need if they do not have access to the American economy. Or you could be even playing smart and trying to be the facade on behalf of China. You will be denied. Or if you are exporting to China, but China's growth could be declining, so that will have an impact in you. So we need to be mindful of these kind of direct first round and second round kind of effects. But I would say that there are many, many solutions on the economic trade investment front. My worry and concern is basically about the political and the security one, not the economic ones, although that they are very much interlinked.
Right. I'll come back to that in a second. But let me pause a question to deepen the conversation that His Excellency Nabil Fahmy started when he said that what we need to do to increase our readiness to address the current state of affairs is to be friends with everybody. If I am to say it in a very flippant and sloppy way. Your Excellency, Nabil Fahmy, is this non-alignment 4.0, neutrality 4.0, or is it multi-alliances that put pressure on all diplomatic institutions, because managing the alliances in different directions that go up and down depending on the temperature of the day is definitely a very big burden on any diplomatic community, let alone those of our size in our region. So explain to me again, please, what do you mean by keeping friends with everybody? Is that non-alignment or neutrality, or what is it exactly? And how do you think diplomatic institutions and communities should get ready for that very strenuous approach?
Thank you, Dean McKellar. I've always had a sensitivity towards the word alliances. It may be because of Egypt's online background and all of that, but I'm not looking for alliances. I'm not interested in alliances. And I'm not interested in trying to play the two elephants in the room and come out without getting damaged in the process, because I'm a pragmatist and realist, although I'm not a Trumpist. Let me respond to your question with two very quick practical examples. I have always argued, different levels of my career, including when I was in government, that we always have to have, Egypt always has to have more than one option. It wasn't about being anti so-and-so or pro so-and-so. It was just being to ensure that Egypt had more choices and could make its own opinion when one of its friends decided it has different priorities to do something else, or was hit by the weather and therefore cannot provide this or that. We should have another option. In many ways, it's like good economics. If you don't want monopolies, you want competition, you want alternatives. And I made this point then, so it's not about, let me even add to that. Even when I was ambassador in Washington, I recommended that we reduce our dependence on aid back then. And it's, of course, less significant now. But the idea was America's changed governments, they change policy, and they're so big, if they make a change and we're not ready, we will be affected by that. Another reason I said this is I went to Moscow 2013-14, and there was tension between us and the Americans. And in the first press conference we held, for Mr. Lavrov and myself, I started off by saying, so there's no misunderstanding. I didn't come here to replace America by you. Sergei was laughing. And then we finished this session, and he came over and said, "Thank you very much for saying that, because if you hadn't said that, nobody would have believed you. The assumption that you're playing us against the Americans and vice versa, it's transparent, it's silly, but of course, I'd like to have more friends, but my real problem is I don't like overdependence, even on friends, because that limits my capacity. It also makes me less efficient. Overdependent on friends, taking things out of, if you want, rational calculations, creates soft bellies, and soft bellies ultimately are unhealthy. I would like to see I'd like to see more order in the system, even if I'm not going to be the major superpower. I definitely won't be the smallest power on the block. But for a medium-sized state, and this is my only real issue with all of the comparisons and calculations, for a medium-sized state, I need rule of law to be a cornerstone of my national security, because I'm not going to fight everybody around the globe with every issue. My long answer, therefore, to your question really is, it's really about giving a medium-sized state the best alternatives to choose from and never be cornered in one area or the other. And I take our own country as an example, because, look, we live on two waterways. We actually live in two continents. People forget that Sinai is in Asia, not in Africa. Import a lot of our foodstuff, engage on tourism, foreign investment, you name it. They're all there. So the idea that I won't be affected by the world is just not going to happen. I mean, what happened in the Red Sea reduced 60% of the revenue in the Suez Canal in 1 year, even though I hadn't done anything different.
Right.
So I always have to have another alternative and not depend on anybody or anything too much.
Thank you for this, because that is a great segue for me to go back to ask Dr. Mahmoud Muhiddin a question about how do we end up, after all of this, financing the priorities that the world and humanity has put in front of itself, which we now call the development priorities, at a time when, and correct me if my assumption is wrong, the weaponization of trade and the extensive use of very intrusive, pervasive sanctions is really affecting people's ability to transact freely. So in that context of weaponized trade and sanctions as a threat for every single country and ruler who doesn't behave, and the withdrawal of the US support to the humanitarian agenda, and we don't know when it will come back and how it will come back. And finally, the fact that Europe as a donor for development is not going to be there as readily available in the future as it was in the past, if we want to think that it was good in the past on its promises, because it is securitizing its own budgets, and it has its own internal problems that have resulted in socioeconomic problems that have resulted in the coming of the far right, increasingly so, close to power in Europe. Europe is ailing, and Europe is in trouble. So to make a very long question simpler, it doesn't bode well for financing development, and particularly for countries like ours and many in our region. How are we going to get ready for that in order to sustain that element of independence that His Excellency Nabil Fahmy was trying to encourage us all to work hard for?
Yeah, this is very timely as a question and inquiry, because some of us are here in Cape Town to discuss issues related to financing development and the role of different financial institutions, including the national development banks, not just the multilateral development banks, in dealing with funding growth and development. But all of these questions that you are raising, Dean McCawie, have been very much raised before but now we are pushed to find an answer fast, because what was there raised a few years ago as the end of the current arrangements and the issues related to fixing what's called the international financial architecture, and all of what we inherited from the Second World War. If political scientists and commentators on international affairs call it a kind of an international order, when it comes to economics, finance, and trade, I would really subscribe more to those who would describe what we have more of arrangements rather than rules and order as such. And if they are there, they are not even fair. So we're living in a kind of a suboptimal kind of arrangements. The international financial institutions suffer from even-handedness, problems when it comes to governance, as there is a veto in the Security Council, the single biggest shareholder in the IMF and the World Bank can block some particular decisions. But that all was inherited in 1945, when the majority of developing economies and emerging markets didn't even have the right to vote for membership. Egypt was one of the very few exceptions as one of the founding members of these institutions. So it's really ironic when you see these institutions and these arrangements are being challenged today by those who benefited from it the most. And actually, for those, even when it comes to USAID, how many papers you read, Dean McCawie or Ambassador Fahmy, who said, well, the aid is not really necessarily working for the benefits of the beneficiaries or so-called beneficiaries, it's for the contributors and all of that stuff. But now it's a completely different game, and we need to be prepared for it. Finance for Development in Seville in June and July this year is going to be testing what is left of the old order. And for that, I can just give you specific answers. First, official development assistance, as we know it, is gone. No more. And we have seen the decline of it in relative terms and real terms. Every replenishment of the likes of IDA or vertical funds or all of that, not just from the States, even from Europe, sometimes they say it's fiscal, that they have fiscal constraints, sometimes because they prioritize spending over defense and security or their own humanitarian priorities, especially with the war in Ukraine. Sometimes it's the political shifts. I could really live as an economist with cycles because there is always a trend. But if I can see the trend and I tell you, no, it's just cyclical, I'll be deceiving you. I'm telling you, the trend, ODA, and please, those who are monitoring these matters, from ministries of foreign affairs to international cooperation to ministries of finance, they need to be very much mindful that whatever is coming from this kind of line of business called ODA, that sometimes is concessional finance, not just about aid and grant. It comes from concessional finance, long-term finance. You need to be ready. How to be ready? This comes into this finance for development, because it's not just about ODA. It was about ODA back when we were talking about the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. But now it's more about public-private partnerships, domestic resource mobilization, more on enhancement of trade, including what we discussed so far on issues related to regionalism, matters related to investment in STI, science, technology, and innovation, issues related to localization of impact, getting your budget in discipline, and attracting FDI, and compete forever when it comes to attracting the best investors and the best traders with higher value added in the supply chain. And I always say, if Europe realized, unfortunately, late in the game, that they have existential threat, quoting Mario Draghi in that report on competitiveness, this is not my word, this is his, that EU is facing existential threat unless they invest in all of what I said now, in R&D, in the human capital issues, in matters related to internal cooperation, defense, and actually this is the issue that they were talking about that to what Ambassador Fahmy just mentioned now. They shouldn't be relying on friends. They need really to be relying on themselves in areas related to defense and, surprise, surprise, energy, that they need really to invest more and better in energy, because it is really getting them in a disadvantage when we know that the Americans can get energy cheaper compared to Europe, where they pay 4 times the American average. So this is basically the kind of new game in a fast-changing world. Again, Ian Bremmer says, well, it's a G0, so it's not the G193 of the UN. I hate to say that. I think it's great to see the UN. We need to have it more powered. We need to have more support for it. The G20 definitely is not really functioning as it used to be. G7, question marks. Perhaps it could be a G8 if Mr. Trump is going to be bringing Russia. But this is a kind of a new world that the Gs are different from what they used to be. And then we don't need to get these kind of old arrangements of the past as if they are continuing with us. We shouldn't be fighting the old world. It's a completely different order. And there are many opportunities for us, because if you tell me that this regime of the world is changing, I would say, well, let's work for a different one that could be more inclusive, more efficient, and fair.
We definitely need to work for that. But let me remind you, gentlemen, of the field, the ground, which I know both of you have your hands on its pulse very well. You are examples of global citizens as well as very locally connected, including Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, who spends a lot of time in his own village. There is a sense, and the European elections are telling us so in different European countries, there is a sense of desperation. There is a sense of anger, and in our part of the world, there is a sense of radicalization. I would like each one of you to spend some time on this sentiment. It's a very negative atmosphere that we are living in, all of us around the world. From your experience and with your insights, leave the policy level aside. How do we work in a world with such enormous negative energy, meaning anger, distrust, and potential radicalization? And we'll start with His Excellency Nabil Fahmy.
Okay, thank you. The first part of my answer is this is going to take time. So there's no quick fix, because I think if you want, all of the major powers of the world are in a distorted state of affairs. And leave aside the major powers, what used to be called non-aligned or developing world, or what people like to call now the global south, is not yet up to the capacity to carry the ball in place of the two major powers. I would argue that there are some positive examples. India seems to be growing quite well. Indonesia, a couple of other countries. Dr. Muhyiddin would know much more the actual specifics of which one economically. But I would argue that if you want to have a stable form of governance, being able to look forward, you need to give to provide your people with two things, or at the very least one of them. Either you share a message with them, you have a cause, you have a message. Many years back, it was about independence, freedom, non-alignment, all that kind of stuff, or liberal democracy also. And if you can't provide the message, then you have to be able to provide the basic needs and requirements for fulfillment. So either you have the politics, or you have the resources and the good management to give people resources. And if you want, that's the whole debate between is the world going towards a liberal democracy, or do you want to use the Chinese model and have an efficient system? I don't think you can choose actually between the two. I actually think if you don't try to do both, you ultimately get caught up with the missing part of it because of one particular thing: technology, communication technology. Everybody sees everything, or at least most people see everything. Therefore, you compare yourself not with the person next door, but with the person across the globe who seems to be about your same age bracket, your same income level, but is doing much, much better. And that leads to frustration. The point I'd like to make also, if I may, I really feel that our political systems, our political messages, including liberal democracy, or for that matter, what's happened in the former Eastern Bloc, parts of the Eastern Bloc, particularly Russia, and to a certain degree, even in China. I don't think the communities are actually comfortable with the message. And I would add to that, I'm not sure the message has as much credibility as one can assume. I don't think that going back to liberal democracy is really an easy task to do, or that even if they did it, they would gain credibility before another decade or two. Because the problem with that has been, well, you have violated your own principles. You haven't respected them, you haven't applied them. You've only applied them against adversaries, but not with your friends. And I would argue also that authoritarian alternatives are not the solution either. And in the past, we were always told that in the past it was Soviet Union was in support of liberation of peoples and all of that. And then the actual support for that was less than what is required. And you saw an occupation of territory by force. So we will have at least 5 years of political instability, and hopefully during that period are able to bring back rational thinking to our process and better management, and then choose a more multilateral, I don't mean multilateral by way of doing everything at the UN, but a way of mutual benefits for more than one party.
Yeah, yeah. Which leads me to ask a question in the same vein to Your Excellency, Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen. We were living in a rules-based order. It worked for us sometimes, and most of the time it didn't, but we were living in such an order. Now, both of you seem to be saying, let's get used to the new reality, which will be arrangements-based order and not rules-based order. That sounds to me, as someone who was raised in a different world, that sounds to me very volatile, very uncertain, requires a lot of capacities related to strategic planning under uncertainty, agility, resilience, and all the rest of it. Dr. Mahmoud Mohideen, you are in a country that belongs to another G you didn't mention, which is the BRICS. Any hopes that the BRICS would bring some sanity to the world, by which I mean a more inclusive, equity-driven, rules-based order?
I wish it is. The BRICS is just a nice acronym. And the elements of it, if they get really united and do more together, it will be really a kind of a bloc that we can really consider. But they don't really act like a group. China, India do not see eye to eye in many of the matters. And we have seen, for instance, the relations with the US, where we started, how China is being perceived and how India is being dealt with, not just in the nice reception, but in the strategic alliance, opening trade, exporting military equipments with advanced technologies and all of that. Russia, in terms of being an economic power, yes, it still has some commodities, energy, some investments in technology, but it's not really a super power. Brazil is very far. And when they added the new countries, including our home country, that's a nice gesture of the importance of Egypt regionally, the same they did for Ethiopia, Iran, the Emirates, and invited others. But as a group, I cannot really consider it working as such, because I see it as well from the global field. Do they act together as a bloc and in international financial institutions? Do they vote the same in international organizations? So I can really well give it the benefit of the doubt. I say, well, it is only 20 years old since they had the BRICS and then the BRIC, and then they added South Africa in 2009, and they added small. So let it grow. It's fine. And that could be actually fitting nicely the purpose of what Ambassador Nabil make more friends. This definitely, it doesn't make any harm. More trade, more investment, more collaboration. But I wouldn't really go and exaggerate, as it happened a couple of years ago, when you say, well, we are joining the BRICS. We're going to be trading in BRICS currency, because unfortunately, we will not see a BRICS currency. And that's what it started with, because it doesn't have the three elements. It doesn't have what Janet Yellen mentioned about deep markets and rule of law. It doesn't have the what Iswar Prasad mentioned, the dollar, that its economy did everything wrong, but in relative terms still better. So the old rules and law of relativity better. And then what President Lula mentioned, that we got accustomed to it. Unless it is very much bad, we're going to be shifting from the dollar to something else. So let's be realistic. I'm from a very pragmatic school. I'm trying to be a student of what's happening, especially in the Eastern Hemisphere. I can really learn a lot every day from what the ASEAN in particular are doing. For countries that have been fighting each other, like Cambodia and Vietnam, they have the best relations. They have now a collective policy how to deal with the giants, call them China, India, even Indonesia now is doing more within and through them, as well as a group, without really playing the big brother. So here, this is what I wish to see in our region, to have a kind of a dynamic, flat structure, depoliticized trade, depoliticized investment, do more education and health. Always have your focus on the village and the township, because those who chose Trump and will choose somebody else in the future are basically coming from their own localities and their own communities, happy or unhappy with policies that happen at the top level of government. And then to the point raised by Ambassador Fahmy about which kind of system, is it liberal democracy or something a la China, when they said that they managed to solve the problem of Mr. Churchill, that democracy have its mishaps, but we don't know anything more better about it. They said, well, we have the selective filters, and then we have democracy within and all of that. I would say, let's go back to basics. Governance and freedoms and human rights, good start with good rule of law, and then we call it what we like. And then I'm again, won't really be unhappy with any kind of an economic dynamic, even after a shock. What is the best performing economy last year in Europe? It was the basket case called Greece. What I was happily surprised when the IMF mentioned a couple of countries in Africa considered just yesterday as basket cases. And then they say, well, they are impressed with their economic performance. This is the beauty of economy and finance. It responds to good signals and good policies, and it is faster to change than the political changes. But you need political stability and good sound policies and rule of law and good house under order, in order to make sure that the economy and the finance is going to be flowing in the right direction.
I want to be self-serving and very egoistic and ask my final question to both of you. I cannot miss the opportunity, being in the position I am in a school of global affairs and public policy that wants to believe it is helping train the next generation of policymakers, policy analysts, and hopefully leaders in their communities. I'll pose the question and get quick answers from both of you. What would you say are the main skills and capacities that we need to instill in the next generation, be it generation of diplomats, policymakers, or policy analysts? Your Excellency, Nabil Fahmy, go first.
Thank you, Dr. Mikaeli. I would argue critical thinking, people who are able to understand an issue and look at the possible benefits and possible problems with it or the risks of it. But let me throw something else at you. And it goes in many ways, I think, to what Dr. Mahmoudine is also mentioning. I'm quite open to almost any kind of policy. And I regrettably have to admit that I've made mistakes every now and then. So I'm not sort of a believer that I have all the right answers. But give me 3 criteria in any policy, any decision, and ultimately we'll end up being winners, even if I disagree with the policy. Transparency, accountability, and competition. If you can ensure these 3 elements, you will have an efficient management system. There will be times when you have to take into account certain severe circumstances, excuse me, and provide some support. But if you have these 3 elements, systems will function efficiently, and therefore we can work together and move forward. If you don't, no matter what we teach them or what we don't teach them, we won't get anywhere.
Someone is saying competition without collaboration.
Well, I said transparency, accountability, accountability to competition. So if you have transparency, everybody knows the fact. If you're holding each other accountable, then everybody has a share in doing that. For me, there's no separation between competition and cooperation. And again, take what I'm saying in context. From the very beginning, I've argued that we have to work together towards mutual benefit, not a zero-sum game where one person wins and the other doesn't. So my long answer to Malak is, yeah, for me, competition with the other 2 elements includes cooperation.
Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin.
Well, it's interesting that Ambassador Fahmy has mentioned that, because these are not just lessons to students and those who are trying to make career. These are lessons to countries as well. When the emerging markets crisis happened, the main lesson, or the main lessons, why the crisis happened is lack of the 3 that you mentioned, Ambassador Fahmy. And then they said, well, in order to do better in the future, you emerging markets of Asia, that was almost 30 years ago, 1997, say, well, fairness, transparency, and accountability. And here fairness gets us into leveling the playing field, competition, all of what you said. You cascade that from the countries to the people, I would really say that makes sense as good principles. And then in terms of the tools, based on that discussion and what I learned as well from you through your questions and from the answers of Ambassador Fahmy, I think for the generations that are being educated today is basically learning for life, that the issue of being resilient in order not to be shocked with any kind of a shockable event for us today. They should really take it as this is the new normal, whatever happens. And I think they have built a kind of readiness of resilience to adapt to these kind of shocks that, well, they can really just go with it and then adapt and with pragmatism. But then I go to the issues of pragmatism needs to be principled as well. Otherwise, it will be very much loose. So I would say here, investment in the resilience, and through that kind of how to teach people to be pragmatic with principles, what kind of principles you need to be protecting while we are pragmatic in the maneuvers. And then we need really to be ready for a world that is, yes, it's fast changing, but there are some fundamentals in these changes. Some old rules of growth, accumulation, getting matters seriously. It doesn't really mean that it's only transactions. It's transactions based on fundamentals. And those who are winning on technology and digital transformation, and winning because of their investments in sustainability. And for the students, regardless their topic, from medicine to political science to engineering to others, they need really to be acquainted with these kind of changes, because otherwise we see them as a trend coming. But if you are not really prepared for the trend or that train, you will be disrupted and you would lose. So it's basically, this is what we need really to have. And finally, it's like countries. I admire our brothers and sisters in some of the richer countries in our region, including in the Gulf. They are admitting that their oil is not forever and their natural gas is not forever. And they are trying to diversify where the diversification in their countries is almost impossible for land, for size, for demography. For a country like ours, we have all of the initial conditions for easier diversification if we want to, but we need to push it faster and harder. So we are in a better initial conditions if we are taking diversification faster. And for that, we need to train as well the new generation to be ready with a portfolio of tools and toolkit that they can maneuver with.
I am struck, I have to admit before I let you go, I'm struck by the fact that this pragmatism, problem solving, as our colleague Malak has said in the chat room, the arrangements-based order, all of that tells me that we reached a stage where there is an end to isms. There is no ism from which we draw our principles and values. Social democracy is as weak as it can get nowadays, and the current and the most recent elections in Germany and elsewhere in Europe show that. And capitalism is taking a turn that, as Dr. Muhyiddin has said, from one crisis to the next and drawing us more and more towards inequality and what have you. Gentlemen, do we have no isms anymore? And we'll just have to take it one crisis at a time?
It depends on whether the question is, do we have isms, or can we have isms? Again, I regret having to repeat myself because I appear to be a bit redundant here. I honestly believe that in the larger meaning of multilateralism, it's the only road to success for the global environment, unless we realize that some will benefit more than others, but we all are part of the same package and need to work together. So that ism, I'm all on board, but anything that's a bit much more individualistic, in the absence of a package, it's a bit of a problem. But you will always have exceptions.
Any thoughts, Dr. Muhyiddin?
Well, back, I think it was 2018, before this debate, I co-authored a piece with one of your scholars, Dr. Rana Hindi, about different schools of thought. That was very much focused on the tension between ideas, ideologies, institutions, and power. So, and you know, economics had been run for almost 2 centuries in a kind of those two extremes, Marxism, and then you have the liberal schools of Chicago and Hayek, and then you have something in between, and then it goes into different directions. All of that is great to see it in the philosophy, in political philosophy and economic philosophy. When it comes to practice, pragmatism and survival will get you to get the best out of the school of thought of the past and some of the schools of thought that are under construction and under making. But if we're going to be very dogmatic about it, as it happened in some episodes in our own development and its own experiments, we'll lose a lot, because you'll go just after the theory and after the camp, not after the problem-solving approach. This fast-changing world is telling us, well, use the history for good lessons. Let's agree on the principles that we cannot compromise on or about. And then let's unleash the potential of human thinking and their ability to optimize and provide solutions without really being in fear on how can we reach the goal as far as we reach. The how is about flexibility. The goal should really be more or less fixed, otherwise we'll be lost. And we have seen great examples of success against the odds, by them being with fixed goals, good targets, and then they were very flexible when it comes to picking on different tools based on the time and based on the circumstances.
You've taken us through a very tough, complex journey from the inauguration of Mr. Donald Trump to how we should be facing a very uncertain and volatile world with agility, with critical thinking, transparency, accountability, and competition. You've been very balanced, optimistic at times, and practically, realistically pessimistic at others. I guess this is the name of the game. I cannot thank both of you enough, not only for this conversation, but for all you do in your own time, enriching the public narrative on regional issues, national issues, and global issues. Please keep the good work up, and please accept to come back and talk with us again next time we arrange for such a session. Thank you for the audience who've been very gracious with their time at that late hour of the night. Bon voyage, Dr. Mahmoud Muhiddin, safe travels. And again, Your Excellency Nabil Fahmy, the school that you founded is always happy to have you back and always happy to see you. Good night, everyone, and thank you.
Greetings, Dr. Muhiddin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellency. Thank you, Dimitri.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. All the best.